Hello, everybody. This is Father Michael Bauer here from Our Lady of Grace in Noblesville, and I am filming this video on behalf of Father Dorr, whose indentured servant I am for the rest of my life after all that he's done for me. And so he told me that there are some videos taking place at St. Francis Newman Center to talk about various things. And so he asked me if I would give a talk about the Feast of Pentecost, which I am happy to do. A little bit of background about me. I'm not going to make this a 30-minute exhortation or anything like that. This is going to be very exegetical, informational. I didn't plan a bunch of jokes or anything like that. I hope that's okay. But I think it is kind of exciting. I've spent this whole morning just researching the Feast of Pentecost, and what I want to particularly focus on is the Old Testament background. One of the things I love about reading the Bible is how it all fits together. There's a coherent narrative throughout the whole thing. And so Pentecost is no different. So we know some obvious things about Pentecost, that Pentecost is the birth of the church. It's the pouring out of the Holy Spirit. It's essentially in the sacrament of confirmation, each of us receive like a new Pentecost. But we don't always know the Old Testament background about the Feast of Pentecost. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And there's two main events in the background of the Feast of Pentecost. The first one is from Genesis chapter 10 and 11. Remember the story of the Tower of Babel? Yeah, so the Feast of Pentecost is a reversal of the Tower of Babel. Now, you might be a little bit familiar with that. It's even mentioned in the Catechism. But there's some interesting things about this. Okay, so why was the Tower of Babel so important during this Feast of Pentecost? Well, one of the first things you notice when you read the second chapter of Acts, which describes this event at Pentecost, is St. Luke is very specific to mention that there are people from every nation under heaven who are here at the Feast of Pentecost. Right? So every known nation at the time of St. Luke, there were people from every nation under heaven who were there. All right, so that's significant because that means there were Jews there. It also, the Acts of the Apostles says that there were some Jewish proselytes there, meaning people who had converted to Judaism. Again, that's not always something we think about when we read the Bible, is that the Jews actually made a lot of converts. I remember specifically, I had one professor in seminary who specifically contradicted that. He said that Jews didn't care about making converts at all. They only cared about their own religion. And couldn't be any farther from the truth. I mean, in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy, there are literally laws for Jewish converts. People who didn't have to get circumcised, but were still supposed to follow the Ten Commandments and other laws. They weren't considered full citizens of the nation of Israel, but yet they were God-fearers. They were people who believed in Yahweh, in the one true God. They had heard about all that he had done for them in Egypt. Again, that's partly why when the Israelites were wandering through the desert way back then, oftentimes God would ask them to smite, all these different peoples. And that seems really crazy and unfair to us. But we forget that those people all had an opportunity to repent. They had heard about what had happened in Egypt. They had heard about these glories of Yahweh and the miracles he had performed, and yet they still resisted. All right? So it's kind of interesting when we think about that. All throughout the Old Testament, there are people who are Jews, literally members of the covenant of Israel, but there are also proselytes. Okay? So we see that in the Feast of Pentecost here. There are people from all over the world who came. Now, again, that should remind us of the Tower of Babel. Because it's during the Tower of Babel that all of the nations of the earth actually begin. Before that, everybody was just one family. All right, that's what we read in the book of Genesis. In fact, in the book of Genesis, it gives the appearance that literally the whole world is descended from Adam and Eve. Right, one human family, and at the Tower of Babel, everybody came divided with different tongues and different nations. So we see at the Feast of Pentecost that not only are there people from all over the world, but all of those people are able to hear the voice of the apostles all in their own language. And they're even confused by it. They're confused that they can understand their language. And so it's kind of the exact opposite of the Tower of Babel, where people who were all speaking the same language all of a sudden were confused and no longer spoke the same language. Okay, so I just think that's really interesting. Now, you've you've probably heard some of that before. But here's something that really interests me. When you read the Old Testament, there's all sorts of questions that arise from the text. And there's a lot that is left out and, doesn't explain everything. And so in different parts of the Old Testament, there are commentaries on things that take place. And even outside of the Bible, the ancient Jews used to have commentaries with questions about other things that were excluded from the scriptures. Not really excluded, it's just they weren't considered important enough to be written in there by Moses. So these rabbis kind of include other details of the events. Now, interestingly enough, when you read the rest of the Old Testament and when you read some of those Jewish traditions, there's some other very fascinating commentaries about what happened at the Tower of Babel, and I just want to share that with you. Okay, so I just think this is very interesting. So, first of all, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verse 8, Moses is describing salvation history, and at one point in Deuteronomy 32, chapter 8, he says that the nations were divided according to the sons of God. Okay? The nations are divided according to the sons of God. Right now, in the Old Testament, when you see the word son of God, it typically is a way of describing an angel, and that's how a lot of the ancient Jews thought about it. And so what they thought about that is, well, the nations were begun at the time of the Tower of Babel, and they were divided according to the sons of God. What does that mean? Well, a lot of those ancient Jews, how they understood it, was they understood that at the Tower of Babel, it wasn't just a problem between God and the people, but actually the angels were involved as well. It's an ancient Jewish tradition that believed that in God's glory, in his temple in heaven, he's surrounded by 70 angels, right? It's called the assembly, okay? So there's 70 angels up there with him. And according to some of these Jewish traditions, what happened at the Tower of Babel was it wasn't just God who came down and confused their languages, it was the angels along with him. And in fact, one Jewish tradition, I was just looking this up, said that essentially in heaven, they cast lots for the people. And so each of the people who was going to receive a new language was not only just going to receive a new language, but also was going to receive their own angel, who they would then worship. Okay, and yet Israel's lot was Yahweh himself. Other Jewish traditions say that it was Saint Michael, who obviously is the great angel. Sometimes those are confused in Jewish traditions. But so just think about that. This was very common Jewish understanding, even up to the time of Jesus, that every nation didn't just have its own language, it also had its own angel, right? I think that is very interesting, and I think it's kind of enlightening. When we think about the history of world religion, sometimes one of the things that's fascinated me, reading the history of missionaries, for example, and they would go to new lands and new peoples, sometimes they would find people who were very peaceful, open to the gospel, kind of like a culture of life, just not very progressed. But then other places they would go to were very evil and terrible places, like the Aztec Empire, which practiced so much human sacrifice. And they didn't just offer human sacrifice to any old deity. They called him the god of the darkness, the drinker of blood. Okay, in Aztec language, that's basically a demon. That's the devil. Same thing with the Old Testament. One of the reasons why God made such a big deal about idolatry, which, haven't you ever wondered that? How weird is that these Israelites are always tempted to worship these idols? I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I'm driving down the highway and I see a bunch of cows on the side of the road, I'm not tempted to worship them. And yet, idolatry was such a big deal in the Old Testament. And why? Why? Well, it's because most of those pagan idols, according to the Bible and according to church fathers and ancient Jews, they weren't just little harmless idols. They were demons. When you would offer sacrifice to idols, you were offering sacrifice to demons. And that's also probably why a lot of people did the idolatry, because they literally experienced diabolical powers in those rites. We still see that today. Places like Central and South America, people who worship these very dark idols. They claim to receive power from them, and I kind of believe that, because otherwise, why would they be doing all this? Exorcists say that oftentimes when people get into trouble with demons and being possessed and oppressed and all the other things, a lot of times it starts from some sort of pagan ritual, like going to a card reader or a psychic or something like that. Right? So these things are connected. And in Jewish tradition, they connected that all the way back with the Tower of Babel. Part of the reasons why you see people with kind of good, harmless pagan religions and some people very evil ones is because, well, they have different angels that they're worshiping. And some angels are good angels. Some angels are fallen angels. All right? Now, so think about this a little bit more. So they believed that there were 70 angels in heaven. And they believed, according to Genesis chapter 10 and chapter 11, that after the Tower of Babel there existed 70 nations on earth. Okay? Now this was very influential in ancient understanding. People just assumed that there were 70 nations on earth. Okay? And that's basically what it was like, until explorers found, Central and South America. I mean, for all the Israelites knew, they just kind of knew the Mesopotamian region and all that stuff. So really, there were just 70 nations they knew of. And so there's this ancient Jewish belief that in all the world, there were just 70 nations. Now, this is helpful for understanding some things in the Scriptures because the number 70 appears in a lot of different places. Like, for example, at the end of the book of Genesis, in the beginning of the book of Exodus, it says that there were 70 descendants of Jacob, or 70 people in the tribe of Jacob who lived in Egypt. In Exodus 24, when Moses leads the people out of Egypt, he ascends a mountain, the mountain of Sinai, to receive the law, and 70 elders ascend with him. In some of the ancient Jewish feasts, they would offer 70 bulls representing the 70 nations of the world. When the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek, the story goes that there were 70 translators who translated it, right? We call it the Septuagint. Now, the number 70 appears again in the New Testament in various places. Remember that? Remember the ministry of Jesus? He has his 12 disciples and he has his 3 main disciples, but there's this episode where he sends out another group. He sends out 70 people. Some translations say it's 72. But a lot of people think it's 70. We could get in that whole debate. We don't need to. But why would Jesus send out 70 people? Well, in a way, because it represents the gospel being preached to all nations. In fact, St. Luke is the only person who specifically mentions this. St. Luke, who's also the only gospel writer who is a Gentile, a member of the nations. Right? So, of course, he would be all about this. Points this out. Jesus sent out 70 people representing the gospel going out to all 70 nations, right? And then in Pentecost, we see this ultimate reversal of Babel. All this division, all this confusion, all this idolatry, it's reversed. And people are now united again under the worship of the one true God, no longer under the worship of idols and angels, okay? Now, all this stuff might seem kind of strange to you, but I promise it didn't seem strange at the time of Jesus. And in fact, the church fathers and even St. Paul on some occasions, he kind of references what I'm talking about. They don't explicitly connect it to the Tower of Babel, but they talk about the worship of idols being the worship of demons. Okay, so you don't have to take my word for it. You can look at the church fathers and other places and see that. Okay, now isn't that so interesting? I just think I've thought about this for years. It's kind of a game changer. It really changes how you think about the Bible, but also about world history and world religions, right? Not pagan idols, but the worship of demons. Okay, so that's one part of the Old Testament background of the Feast of Pentecost. The second part of the Feast of Pentecost, the background, is the giving of the law by God at Mount Sinai, right, which you read about in the book of Exodus. A lot of you are familiar with this, the Ten Commandments, etc., etc. But there's some parts about this that I think are very interesting. Like, first of all, did you know that the Feast of Pentecost is not just a Christian holy day? Did you know that the Jews celebrate Pentecost as well? Modern Jews do, and so did ancient Jews. It was just another feast for them, like Passover and Tabernacles. And in fact, the Feast of Pentecost was one of the greatest feasts for them. Every year there were 3 feasts that every adult male was required to travel to Jerusalem, to the temple for. And one of them was the Feast of Pentecost. That's why at the Feast of Pentecost there were people from every nation under heaven who were there. Okay, so what was the Feast of Pentecost? What was it about? Well, it kind of had a natural significance like other Jewish feasts. It was considered the Feast of the Harvest. So, you're finishing up harvest season, you have this great celebration, and you have the Feast of Pentecost. So here in the Acts of the Apostles, we see there's a great harvest of souls, right, that we see. But it also, like the other Jewish feasts, had a significance in terms of salvation history. The Feast of Pentecost was when they commemorated God's giving of the law at Mount Sinai. Okay, so it's kind of like the giving of the law. So think about that in a couple of ways. I think it's interesting. Because first of all, when we celebrate the new Pentecost with all these apostles speaking in tongues, we recognize that they're kind of receiving a new law, right? It says at one point that after Peter was preaching, it says the people were cut to the heart, right? That should remind us of some prophecies in the Old Testament, like, for example, in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. They said that in the last days, in the coming of the new covenant, God would write his law not on stone, like at Mount Sinai, but rather he would write his law on their hearts, right? So the Feast of Pentecost, we see the people are cut to the heart. When you make a covenant, you cut a covenant in the Hebrew language, right? So it's kind of symbolic. He's writing his law on their heart. And thank God he does. Because in the Old Testament, God gave us a lot of laws and rules, but we didn't receive the grace to follow them like we have in the new law. When we're baptized and we're confirmed, we literally receive grace and our heart is changed to follow God's will and follow God's law. Okay? So I think all that stuff is very fascinating. But again, I want to go a little bit deeper because you may have heard some of those things before, but I want to talk a little bit more in depth. Okay? And I want to start by talking about the transfiguration of Jesus with Moses and Elijah. Okay? Remember this great story of Jesus being with his 3 disciples, calling Peter, James, and John to ascend Mount Tabor with him. And as they fall asleep, they wake up and he's speaking with Moses and Elijah, and he's transfigured and his clothes are white as snow. One of the things that the gospel writers say is they actually mention what Jesus was talking about with Moses and Elijah. You remember what he was talking about? He was talking about his departure, or literally in Greek, his exodus. His exodus. Okay? This is a very dominant theme in Jesus' ministry, which I think is not noticed enough by a lot of us who read the Bible. The biggest expectation the Jews had at the coming of Jesus was the Messiah was going to be like a new David, but he was also going to be like a new Moses, who was going to lead us into a new Exodus. Okay? And we see that in the life of Jesus. Just like Moses, he gives us bread from heaven, except for his bread is his own flesh. Just like Moses, he gives us a new Passover, but his Passover is not eating of a lamb, but rather eating of the flesh of the true lamb, Jesus himself. Like Moses, who gave us the old law, Jesus gives us a new law. Just like Moses founded the old nation of Israel, so Jesus reconstitutes the new nation of Israel, represented by his 12 disciples. Okay? Jesus is constantly acting as a new Moses. Now, this helps so much when you're reading the Gospels. If there's ever something that you come across that seems confusing, you don't really understand what it's about, oftentimes, if you start thinking about it in terms of a new Exodus, it makes light of it. For example, Jesus tells his disciples in his ministry that they will sit on thrones and judge the sons of Israel. What is that imagery of thrones? Well, it goes back to the time of Moses. Moses was the judge of the people. And remember, at one point, he realizes there are too many cases to be judged, and he can't judge them all. And so his father-in-law convinces him to appoint representatives from Israel to judge the people, right? And so Jesus tells the disciples they are going to be like new judges who judge alongside him in the new covenant, the new kingdom. Okay, this is so interesting. It makes sense of so much stuff. Now, there's more. Okay, the Feast of Pentecost. The reason why it commemorates the giving of the law at Mount Sinai is because it literally, the law was given at Mount Sinai 50 days after Passover. So here we are in the New Testament reading about the Feast of Pentecost, which took place 50 days after Jesus' Passover feast. Okay? What we understand is the fact that Jesus is leading us through a new Exodus. He's literally reliving the old Exodus, but in a transformative way. Okay? So just as the old Exodus started on the night of Passover, this new Exodus starts on the night of Passover, when Jesus celebrated the Last Supper and gave up his life. The new Pentecost occurs 50 days after that Passover, just like it did in the beginning. And there's all sorts of other things. Like, for example, remember how long the Israelites were wandering in the desert? They wandered in the desert for 40 years, right, after that initial Passover. And at the end of those 40 years, what was the first thing they did? They entered into the Promised Land. And how did they enter the Promised Land? They had to conquer Jericho, and Jericho's walls fell, right? In the new Exodus, 40 years after the death of Jesus, 40 years after his Passover, guess what happens? Another place is conquered and destroyed, and its walls fall. It's the temple in Jerusalem. Fall 40 years later. Okay, so all this is super interesting. Now, again, I think this kind of makes sense of some of the things we see at in Acts chapter 2 in this great Feast of Pentecost. How is it connected to the giving of the law at Sinai? We already mentioned how the old law was written on stone. This new law is written on the heart. Okay, we talked about that. But there's some other parts here. Jesus, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. What I was going to say is, notice that there are tongues of fire that come down upon the apostles. What did that signify? I've looked all sorts of different commentaries, and most of them are just not helpful for this at all. What do the tongues of fire represent? What most commentaries say is that it's a harken back to the giving of the law at Sinai, which we're already talking about. They say at the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, there was a cloud of smoke, there was fire, there were thunderstorms, all these different things. But what most of them fail to point out is that what it represents is it's literally a new happening of the giving of the law at Sinai. If you look back at chapter 19 of the book of Exodus, when it talks about this giving of the law, it says that not only was there fire on the mountain, but literally God descended upon them in fire, right? Just like what happens at Pentecost. The Holy Spirit descends upon the apostles in fire, okay? But there's more, again, with Jewish traditions. Again, those Jewish traditions, they used to say that the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, when it says that God descended in fire, it wasn't just that they saw fire, but it was literally God speaking. His voice was descending in fire. So it wasn't that they just heard God's voice. It was that they could see God's voice. They could see his tongues, his languages in fire. Right? Psalm 29:4 says that the Lord's voice speaks flames of fire. And what would that look like? Flames of fire descending while God is speaking? It looks like a fiery tongue. In fact, some Jews just came out and said that, like Philo in the first century, right, a contemporary of Jesus. He said that the law descended in tongues of fire by means of the angels. Okay, so all this stuff, if you're an ancient Jew, all this stuff makes so much more sense with all these different Jewish traditions. You see this Feast of Pentecost saying, whoa, this is a big deal. Okay? Last thing I just want to point out about this, again, how this new Pentecost is just like the old Pentecost. What we read at the end of Acts chapter 2 is we hear about how many people were converted on this great feast. You remember how many people were converted to the gospel? That's right, 3,000 people. Okay, 3,000 people were converted. Why is that significant? Well, because at the time of the first Pentecost, the first giving of the law at Mount Sinai, there's another time where 3,000 occurs. You remember what happened? So, after God gave the law to the people on Mount Sinai, after they made this great covenant with him, they did something very bad. Israelites worshipped the golden calf, right? Not a good idea. Right after the God of the universe frees you from slavery, does all these miracles for you, not a good idea to make an idol. And God was very upset about it. And so in response, he told Moses to slay all those who had created the idol and who had worshipped it. And he asked the Levites specifically to be the ones who carried out that execution. And 3,000 people were slain that day, according to the book of Exodus. Okay? So here in the new Pentecost, in Acts chapter 2, we see that 3,000 people are slain again at the giving of the law. Except for this time, they're not slain by the sword. Rather, they're slain in the Spirit. Right? It's a new Pentecost. Isn't this just so interesting? All right, last thing I need to say. I know I said I was going to say one last thing, but one last thing I want to say. Again, Jewish traditions. One of the things they thought was because the Jews at Mount Sinai, because they had made some proselytes, they assumed that there were probably people from different nations who were there at Mount Sinai with the Jewish people. And so many of the Jewish rabbis, ancient Jewish traditions, they said that God spoke to them and they could hear God. Remember, the giving of the law wasn't given by means of Moses. First, God spoke to the people, right? He descended upon them in fire, and they could hear the law. Now, if there's people from all different nations there hearing this, they would have had to hear it in their own language. And that's exactly how many of the Jewish commentators used to understand it. People were there hearing the law, and they heard it in their own language. In fact, some commentaries say that God spoke in 70 languages so that every nation on the earth was represented and could be heard. Which, could you not think of a more clear prefiguration of this Feast of Pentecost we read about in the book of Acts? Okay, I did not think I was going to go this long, but just exciting things to talk about. I hope that was coherent. I don't have time to edit this video, but I am going to be answering your questions. So if there's anything confusing, we can talk more about it. All right, God bless you guys.